When we think of the Wild West, we often picture a lonely cowboy riding into the sunset or a dusty main street in a quiet town. But the reality of building the first Transcontinental Railroad was nothing like the quiet frontier. It was a loud, violent, and industrial invasion that moved across the plains like a storm. They called it Hell on Wheels. Most people believe that name just referred to the rough towns that sprang up along the tracks, but the truth is much darker and more complex. These weren't just chaotic outposts full of gambling and trouble. They were a parasitic system designed to drain every dollar from the men who were building the future of America. The camps followed the end of track across Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming, bringing a wave of boom, bust, and burn that lasted only weeks before the whole town was packed onto flat cars and moved to the next spot. It was a cycle of extreme labor, predatory economics, and brutal violence that collided head-on with the native tribes of the plains. Part 1. To understand the chaos of the towns, you first have to understand the discipline of the railroad itself. The Union Pacific Railroad was not built by a disorganized mob. It was built by an army. The logistical genius behind this massive project came from two brothers, General John Jack Casement and his brother Dan. Casement was a former brigadier general in the Union Army, and he ran his construction crews with the same strict martial law he had used during the Civil War. The workforce was huge, numbering between 1,000 and 2,000 men, depending on the season. Many of these men were veterans, both from the Union and the Confederacy, working alongside Irish immigrants and emancipated African Americans. They were organized into brigades and companies, mirroring the military structures they had just left behind. This was necessary because they were essentially a mobile industrial city pushing into the wilderness. They called this mobile base the City on Wheels. It consisted of a massive train of boxcars that had been converted into dormitories, dining halls, and kitchens. A locomotive pushed this train to the very end of the track every single day. This meant the workers were always right next to the job site, wasting no time on commuting. The work itself was a grueling assembly line. Miles ahead of the train, graders broke the earth and leveled the roadbed. Behind them came the tiemen, bedding the wooden ties into the ground. Then came the iron men, the elite crews who physically carried and placed the heavy iron rails. Finally, the spikers and bolters secured the rails to the ties. Observers described the sound of this work as a grand anvil chorus played across the plains. The rhythm was hypnotic and exhausting. It took 3 strokes to the spike, 10 spikes to a rail, and 400 rails to a mile. By the time the line reached San Francisco, it is estimated that the men had swung their sledgehammers 21 million times. This took a staggering toll on the human body. The pressure to move fast was immense. The Union Pacific was in a race against the Central Pacific, which was building eastward from California. The government paid the railroads based on mileage, so speed was more important than quality. In 1868, the rivalry got so heated that when the Central Pacific set a record for laying track, General Casement offered his men triple pay if they could lay 8 miles in a single day. This required a logistical ballet of supply trains and brute strength, but the men got it done. Fueling this army required a massive amount of food. The diet was designed for fuel, not nutrition. The men ate huge amounts of beef, potatoes, beans, and fresh bread baked right on the train. Cattle barons drove herds hundreds of miles to the railhead to keep the crews fed. When the dinner signal blew, thousands of men would swarm the dining cars, eating in shifts before rushing back to the line. It was a life of hard discipline and harder work, but when the sun went down, the discipline of the City on Wheels gave way to the anarchy of the Hell on Wheels. Part 2. The Hell on Wheels towns were not permanent settlements. They were temporary, disposable cities that followed the workers like parasites. As the track moved west, these towns, made of canvas tents and prefabricated wooden fronts, would be taken apart, loaded onto flat cars, and shipped to the new end of the line. One of the most infamous of these towns was Julesburg, Colorado, in the summer of 1867. This was actually the 4th version of Julesburg, built near the ruins of a settlement that had been burned down by Cheyenne and Lakota warriors just 2 years prior. By July, Julesburg attracted a population of 4,000 people. It was known as the wickedest city. The town was filled with gamblers, desperados, and women of the night. Dance halls like the King of the Hills kept the music and lights going all night long. The violence eventually became so bad that it disrupted the railroad construction. General Grenville Dodge, the chief engineer, had to order General Casement to clean up the town. Casement used his troops to enforce martial law. When Dodge later asked where the gamblers had gone, Casement famously took him to the graveyard and said, "There they are, General. They died with their boots on." Another town that captured the brutal nature of this life was Benton, Wyoming. Benton existed for less than 3 months in 1868, located in a harsh, waterless desert known as the Red Desert. It was a miserable place. The dust was described as being 8 inches deep, covering everyone in a ghostly white powder. A man in a black coat walking through Benton looked like a cockroach struggling through a flour barrel. Water was so scarce it had to be hauled from the North Platte River and sold for $1 a barrel. That was a massive sum of money in those days. The center of Benton was the Big Tent, a canvas structure 100 feet long that served as a saloon, dance hall, and gambling den. Right next door, a doctor set up a tent to treat gunshot wounds and diseases, creating a convenient cycle of vice and repair. When the railroad moved on, Benton vanished completely. A year later, there was hardly a trace left. Part 3. The economy of these camps was a closed loop. The railroad paid the workers, and the hell-on-wheels merchants took that money right back through inflated prices, gambling, and whiskey. The cost of living was incredibly high. Cheap, rot-gut whiskey, which cost 25 cents a gallon back east, was sold for 25 cents a glass in the camps. Simple items like water became luxury goods. If a worker wanted to buy a Henry rifle for protection or hunting, it would cost him $40 to $50. That represented months of savings for a laborer who might only earn $30 a month. But most of the money didn't go to supplies. It went to the gamblers. Professional gamblers followed the paymaster's train, and it was estimated that a huge portion of the payroll ended up in the gambling tents within 48 hours of the men getting paid. Games like Faro and Monte were rigged to strip the workers of their earnings before they could send a dime home to their families. Appreciate what we're uncovering? Please be sure to like the video, subscribe for more, hit that notification bell, and share your opinion in the comments. Part 4. There were also renowned figures in these camps who have been misunderstood by history. One such character was Eleanor Dumont, better known as Madame Mustache. She was a skilled blackjack dealer who commanded respect in the rough camps. She had a sarcastic habit of buying a glass of milk for any man she had just cleaned out at the card table, a small gesture of mothering to the man she had just bankrupted. Sadly, years later, she would take her own life in Bodie, California, ending a legendary run across the West. Another famous name often associated with these camps is Calamity Jane. However, the popular image of her as a heroic Army scout during this specific time is largely a myth. Research suggests that Martha Canary, her real name, was a camp follower who worked various jobs, including as a laundress and dance hall girl. Her fame as a scout was mostly a dime novel invention created later in her life. During the railroad construction, she was known more for her struggles with alcohol and her drifting lifestyle than for any military service. But the internal chaos of the camps was nothing compared to the external war being waged against the Native American tribes. The construction of the Union Pacific was an invasion that cut directly through the hunting grounds of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. The railroad bisected the buffalo herds that were the foundation of the Plains Indian economy. Native oral histories describe the first time warriors saw the train. One Cheyenne warrior, Porcupine, said it looked like a white man's pipe smoking as it moved across the land. It was an alien industrial beast. The military leaders like General Sherman and General Dodge understood that the railroad would destroy the buffalo and, by extension, the native resistance. Their policy was explicit. They encouraged the slaughter of bison, believing that for every buffalo dead, an Indian was gone. Passengers would even shoot bison from the windows of moving trains for sport, leaving the carcasses to rot in the sun, a terrible waste to the tribes who used every part of the animal. The tribes did not take this invasion lying down. They adapted their tactics to fight this new industrial enemy. One of the most famous incidents was the Plum Creek derailment in 1867. A band of Cheyenne, led by Chief Turkey Leg, realized the Iron Horse was trapped on its tracks. They didn't use explosives. They simply lashed a railroad tie across the rails. A freight train struck the obstruction and derailed. The engineer and firemen were killed instantly. But what happened to the brakeman, William Thompson, is one of the most gruesome survival stories of the West. Thompson was shot and scalped by a warrior, but he pretended to be dead. In the chaos, the warrior dropped the scalp. Thompson waited until the coast was clear, retrieved his own scalp from the dirt, and crawled away. He later traveled all the way to Omaha carrying his scalp in a pail of water, hoping a doctor could reattach it. That scalp is actually still preserved in a museum in Omaha today. After the crash, the warriors looted the train, which was carrying dry goods. Historical accounts describe a surreal scene where the warriors took bolts of bright calico cloth and tied them to their horses' tails. As they rode away across the prairie, long banners of colorful fabric streamed behind them, a striking image of Neolithic warrior culture colliding with industrial mass production. Part 5. The story of the Hell on Wheels camps is often romanticized in movies and TV shows, but the reality was far grittier. There is a popular legend that General Jack Casement once had his men beat a crowd of gamblers with axe handles to restore order. While Casement was certainly a tough disciplinarian, military records don't support the idea of a mass bludgeoning. The story is likely an exaggeration of his strict methods. However, the Bear River City Riot of 1868 was very real. In this instance, the workers themselves rioted against the town. Hundreds of railroad graders were angry about the imprisonment of a comrade and the inflammatory editorials written by Leigh Freeman, who ran a newspaper called the Frontier Index. The mob burned the jail and destroyed the printing press. The town citizens fought back, resulting in 16 deaths and the declaration of martial law. It showed the deep divide between the rough laborers who built the railroad and the merchants who wanted to civilize the West. The Hell on Wheels phenomenon came to an end as quickly as it started. Once the Golden Spike was driven in 1869, the massive workforce dispersed. The temporary towns like Benton vanished into the dust, leaving only scattered trash and graves behind. Other towns like Cheyenne and North Platte survived because the railroad selected them for permanent repair shops and depots. The construction of the railroad was a magnificent engineering achievement, but it came at a terrible human cost. It was built on the backs of Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and former slaves who worked themselves to the bone for triple pay and bad whiskey. It was a project that fueled a predatory economy of vice and violence, and it was the weapon that ultimately broke the resistance of the Plains tribes by bringing civilization and destruction to their doorstep. When we look back at the Old West, we have to remember that the Hell on Wheels wasn't just a catchy name. It was a brutal mobile machine that changed America forever, leaving a trail of blood, iron, and ghost towns in its wake. If you had to live in one of these rough railroad towns for a month, do you think you would have survived the gamblers in Julesburg or the alkali dust of Benton? Let me know in the comments.